I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Marketing Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, nonprofit MSI serves as the bridge between marketing theory and business practice, and our goal is to move the needle on significant marketing problems. We do this by funding research by leading academics worldwide on topics voted by our corporate sponsors and disseminating that research through members-only events and a variety of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. First, I'd like to point out with the chat with presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Andrew during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Andrew Stephen is the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at the University of Oxford Said Business School. He's a leading academic authority on digital marketing and was recently rated as one of the top 25 marketing professors in the world by the American Marketing Association. He is the head of the marketing faculty at the Said School and the founding director of the recently launched Oxford Future of Marketing Initiative, which brings together academics and marketing professionals to chart the future of marketing discipline. Andrew grew up in Brisbane, Australia, has a degree in engineering and business from the University of Queensland, and a master's and PhD with distinction from Columbia University in the U.S. He has taught prior to his career at the Said School at INSEAD, University of Pittsburgh, and Columbia Business School. He, among other things, is currently engaged in a multi-year study of the longer-term effects of social media use on consumers' psychological, financial, and physiological well-being. He is published in all the top journals and has received a number of awards, including Marketing Science Institute's Alden G. Clayton Award. He also recently chaired a meeting that MSI hosted along with his colleague Kate Lamberton on helping us better develop a set of priorities and topics on understanding digitized customers and digitized environments, and I think you'll be hearing a bit more about that from Andrew. And he is also co-authored with Kate the special issue of Journal of Marketing that was recently distributed by MSI at our trustees meeting, and this is a series of articles by leading academics on key marketing topics that were priorities for MSI at the time that they were written. So I believe, again, we'll be hearing more from Andrew about that. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Andrew to tell us what we need to know about digital, social, and mobile marketing.
All right. Thank you, Earl, and thanks to all of you for being here on the webinar today. So I'm going to talk about digital marketing, digital, social media, and mobile marketing to be a little bit more precise. The plan for the webinar, and I'll talk for about half an hour, to allow some time for Q&A at the end. So definitely type in those questions, and Earl's going to collate them and moderate the Q&A once I'm done talking. But first I want to give you a little bit of a background to this topic and some of the research that's being done around this topic that Earl actually referred to in terms of some work that has just been published in a special issue of the Journal of Marketing, co-sponsored by MSI and the American Marketing Association, which is really around digital, social media, and mobile. What do we know? And then more importantly, I think, what don't we know, and what we should do. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll sort of briefly also touch on some views I have in terms of how we can go about filling this gap in some sense, and then thinking about what happens next. And I know the audience on the webinar today is a mix of practitioners and academics, and part of the story here is I'm going to be calling for even more collaboration than we currently have, which is quite a lot, but even more around some of these important emerging topics within marketing. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Before I continue, what I thought I'd do is I'd acknowledge a collaborator on a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today, Kate Lamberton, who's a former colleague of mine at the University of Pittsburgh. Kate and I worked together on a lot of this research, so I would say the ideas that you like that I'll talk about, you can attribute them happily to Kate, and then the things that you disagree with, I'll take full responsibility for. But certainly this is joint work that we've been doing over the years, and then really something that's come out of our discussions with each other colleagues, and then of course also the marketing practice world. So some background here. So Earl mentioned that there's been this special issue of the Journal of Marketing, which was great because it was organized around MSI research priorities, and it gave a number of teams of academics an opportunity to really take a step back, think big picture on some important priority themes and topics related to really future-oriented topics within marketing, and sort of take stock of the situation. And so Kate Lamberton and myself were invited to do that with respect to digital, social media, and mobile marketing. So what that resulted in was this nice paper, and it fits into this framework that appears in this issue of the journal, which sort of is sort of the pathways to marketing value creation or superior marketing performance. And we fit right here, along this line, I think, in terms of what the authors of that framework argue is leveraging social media. I'd expand that a little bit and say we've really got to leverage digital media channels in smart ways in order to really extract the most value from marketing. I think this is just the way things are these days, regardless of which segments you're targeting and the types of media channels you are in, and also the types of products or services that you're offering to the markets. So with that in mind, what do we really mean by leveraging digital media channels? So there's lots of digital channels. It's probably a pretty obvious understatement to just kind of bucket them as things like social media and mobile. There's a lot going on even within all those different types. So there's a lot of complexity. But I'd sort of say if we were to pick three themes, I'd say one is mobile, one is social media, and I think the other one is data and analytics, and how we use that, because it's really fundamental for modern marketing. And so that's sort of where we approached this research, and sort of where I'm going to be coming from in talking about, to some extent, what we know versus what we don't know but should. But it would be remiss of me to not kind of point out some things that I think are coming up on the horizon that are fast becoming serious and important topics in marketing practice, and should be in marketing academia as well. One of them is artificial intelligence in general. How does that play a role in the way we do marketing, the way that, say, advertising is done, the way that consumers behave and make decisions? Another one is robots, whether it's, say, a physical robot. For example, here's actually a picture of my son. This is in a hotel lobby in Tokyo, in Japan, earlier this year. This is the concierge of the future, apparently. And my little 2-year-old there is probably only going to know this sort of concierge of the future. For him, that's going to be what it is. But whether it's robots in the physical sense like that, or it's software-based robots, chatbots, for example, in Facebook Messenger, for example, I think these are things that are on the rise. And then, of course, there's also technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, which are absolutely coming into the mainstream now, that marketers are probably all starting to think about also, and trying to decide how they grapple not only with how you could use these new technologies in some sense as new touch points, but whether you should, how do you even assess their performance, and then also, I think importantly, how do you then deal with the new streams of data that these new types of channels or touch points are going to create. So I say all of that just in some sense to reinforce the point that this is a really, really complex space. It's really fast moving. There's a lot of innovation going on the technology side, and I think that's really exciting. But it does beg the question, where does this leave us? So we've got all of this stuff going on. We've seen massive explosions in things like customer data, in all the different digital and social media channels that marketers now have to worry about. We see all these new technologies constantly on the horizon that are sort of, just out there in front of us that we're maybe excited about, but also worried about in terms of how that fits into everything else, and is it really worth the trouble? And in studying this and in doing research on this and teaching these sorts of things for a while now, what I've come to realize is I think we have to be very, very careful when it comes to technology and marketing. And this is just a little screenshot of an interview I gave with a marketing magazine recently that was kind of along these lines. But the point really is, I think there's so many exciting things happening in the technology space, in the digital space, that intersects with marketing, which is great, but we need to be thoughtful and careful. So I sort of lay that out there because I'm going to come back to that theme later on in this webinar. So let's get back to the piece of research that my colleague Kate Lamberton and I recently published, and that was really supported a lot by MSI. So what do we do for this research? Just to give you a sense of the process. So we looked at academic research in all the top marketing journals published in the window 2000 to 2015 that had anything to do with digital, social media, or mobile, in a substantive way. So we took a look at all that. It's about 160 odd papers. We had a look at what the authors studied and what they found. And then we also looked at how this aligned with what practitioners were focused on, by looking at what was being talked about a lot in the business press, in the sort of the popular business press around the same time. So we could sort of see, where are their points of alignment, where are their points of sort of disagreement or misalignment, I suppose. So that was sort of the process. Now, what do we find? So I'm going to walk you through a few of the findings. Not going to go through all of them because it's an academic article, so it's a long it's a long document. But I'm going to sort of highlight a few things that I think are pertinent to this discussion this afternoon. So the first one is just the sort of the popular topics, if you will, or popular sort of themes that were, or keywords that were represented in these articles. So like I said, when we looked at this sort of 16-year window of academic research and marketing in the very best outlets, there's 160 pieces of work, and we saw 200 different keywords, and 83.5% of them were used only once. And so you can see here, this is just a chart that's the number of articles per keyword. So the first one, the most popular one, is actually model types and analysis. So in other words, technical details about the way the authors went about doing their research, methodological aspects. So if you sort of take that one out and look at the next one, it's advertising. And then sort of the next two, psychological processes and outcomes and networks, were also really big. And so if you sort of look at those, you get a sense of really what the focus has been in the academic literature in terms of digital marketing over, say, the last 15 or so years. It's really largely been around marketing communications in terms of advertising. And then we see, trying to understand the consumer behavior side of it with the psychological processes, and then networks, which is really tapping into the rise of social media. And then some other things like user-generated content, that's UGC, that's the next one, search advertising, and so on. But there's this very long tail, which, when we looked at this, we realized, okay, this is pretty fragmented literature. There are some recurring themes, but really lots of stuff going on, which I think is naturally reflective of the space in which these academics are working. This a constantly changing, new, certainly back in 2000, if you think of it back then, digital marketing is a pretty new thing. So it kind of makes sense that there's lots and lots of different topics that have been covered in somewhat a fragmented way, but not necessarily bad in terms of fragmentation. And I think the top 6 topics really kind of say it all in terms of how people have been, how academics have been focusing in terms of the research topics within digital, social media, and mobile, in marketing. I think that's important. The other finding that I thought I'd share is citations. So to the practitioners listening to this webinar, as you may or may not know, one measure of the impact of our work is citations, in one form of impact at least. And so it's just another way to sort of see what's getting discussed or talked about, which ideas in some sense are catching on, and sort of propagating throughout the academic literature over time. And really the top four, you can see sort of this is just a plot of the time series of that. But really the big winner in that race, if you will, is word of mouth. If we sort of organize these into themes or topics, really the most impactful topic that gets researched on and built upon in terms of cited work in the academic marketing literature really is around word of mouth, online word of mouth, e-word of mouth, call it what you will. Followed by social networks, decision aids, and user-generated content. Decision aids is a term that we came up with to sort of reflect research that is looking at how technology, how digital channels, for example, help consumers make decisions. So how it helps them search for products or identify better products, things like that, and how that impacts sort of the buyer behavior, decision-making process. So that gives you just, again, a bit of a flavor of really what the set of topics were in terms of what people were looking at. And then, of course, within all of these, there's lots and lots and lots of different findings that, for the sake of time, I won't be going into. So we sort of found, the other thing is some major themes running over time. So in some sense, this is how digital, social media, and mobile marketing has sort of been looked at. So first of all, looking at these types of media really as ways for individuals to express themselves. So the sharing of opinions, word of mouth, being a sort of a conduit for that. The other second theme there is how are these used as marketing tools or marketing channels? And then the third one, which I think is not to say the other two aren't important, but I think the third one is probably increasingly important, is digital as a source of marketing intelligence. And an example of that, which is a very, very recent one, would be the increasing use of things like social media listening as sort of a complement to other forms of customer insights and marketing intelligence. So I think we've been seeing these themes running over time, and what was interesting is we sort of saw how different types of technologies sort of tapped into each of these three themes over time. So it wasn't sort of that one theme went away because we stopped using social media for individual expression. No, it's just different ways of using social media for individual expression over these sort of eras of technology development and marketing. So that's one thing. The second one, there's just a lot of research on word of mouth, which I think is great, but one of our critiques is there's more to digital marketing than word of mouth. So I think we need to do a better job of that. And I think the other finding, which is perhaps not surprising because of the fragmentation that I mentioned before, but it's somewhat concerning nonetheless, is a lot of research on what I call shiny new toys. So people studying lots of new tools, platforms, and channels. And in some case, when you study this thing, you don't know if it's going to take off, so you're placing a bet. So some were good bets, and others were not so good bets. So people have been publishing papers on things like Groupon, which, as we all know, kind of dwindled. But that hasn't stopped academics from working on papers about Groupon. Not to say that's a bad thing, but it's just to illustrate the point that maybe we need to be more careful from the academic side in terms of what's relevant and to ensure that what we're doing is not just interesting and reflecting some cool new marketing approach, but actually is a relevant marketing approach that that practice cares about too. So from the practitioner side, this is what we saw as being popular over time. So a bit different to sort of the major topics that the academics were doing research on. So here really the big one was social media. And really you could almost combine the first two, social media marketing and social networks, into one sort of mega category that would dwarf everything else. This is based on what's being talked about in the popular business press, not necessarily what is being talked about in the boardroom. So that's a caveat. But nonetheless, it suggests a big focus on sort of this new form of communications that have come about in the last decade or so in terms of social media, or what we now call social media, as opposed to a lot of the other things. So that's partly there in terms of what the academics were focusing on, with things like word of mouth. But the academics were also a bit more interested in things like digital advertising and search engine marketing and so on. So I think there's overlap in terms of an interest in networks and social media more broadly, but also some points of difference there, which is important because that again comes back to this point about maybe there's been a bit of a lack of relevant research in some parts of what marketers have been doing. So what do I need to know more about? So, I really think, in coming out of this research, what we argue is that one problem is there's this disconnect. And so how do we really address that? How does academia do a better job of helping practice keep up with the pace of change in this technology? I think to think about that, though, we need to keep in mind a couple of things. So firstly, the way I think about marketing and where growth comes from, it's about building, managing, and expanding marketing assets. It's not just using new technology platforms. And I think this is an important point, because if we're to think about the future and think about what don't we know but we really should know, I think we need to remember that it's not about putting the technology first. It's about remembering what marketing is meant to be doing in terms of value creation, and using these channels, these digital social media and mobile channels and whatever else is on the horizon, to create value in a purposeful way, as opposed to just using technology because it's cool and interesting and it's sort of a shiny new toy. So the way I would think about it is sort of present just really quickly a little framework that I've developed recently called Marketing with Purpose. And so I think if you think about the value creation, there's got to be value to the business. You've got to keep the lights on. There's got to be value to people in terms of your customers and your employees, and then there should be probably some consideration for societal purpose. And technology and data can help you achieve this. But I think around this, layered on top of that, is how you go about creating value in a sort of technology-enabled manner. And it's about complex systems thinking, it's about problem solving, and it's about understanding impacts and making them positive. And so what do I mean by that? So I think problem solving is really about seeing marketing problems and thinking about how technology might be able to help solve a problem, but not thinking of technology as necessarily the only solution. So technology should be probably part of the solution these days, but it's not going to be everything. I think critically, the second point, complex systems thinking, is increasingly needed. Unfortunately, what comes with complex systems thinking is this notion that everything's a big messy system with lots and lots of moving parts, and we like to maybe try and simplify and distill things into more digestible components. But the reality is, in say the media landscape these days, even just in the digital space, everything is connected in one way or another. There are complex interaction effects between how different media channels work to influence a consumer's purchasing decision, for example. So we need to capture those. We need to understand them better. So we need to really see, what's happening in media, what's happening in advertising, what's happening with people in social media, and so on and so forth as a complex system, and really understand it that way. And the third one is understanding impacts and making them positive. And this speaks a little bit more to, say, the consumer behavior aspect. So how does using a mobile to shop impact the consumer versus, say, going into a store or using a laptop or whatever else? Are there some detrimental consequences of that? Can we make them more positive? So I think with every new technology or every new sort of marketing touch point or customer touch point that comes along, we need to more carefully understand how they impact the attitudes and behaviors that we care about at the consumer level. And then where there's a detrimental effect, we need to figure out ways to mitigate that or turn it into a positive. So I think we need to do more of that as well to really push the needle forward in grappling with new technological changes that come to bear on the marketing landscape. And so to give an example of, I think, an approach to this, and Earl alluded to this in his introduction earlier. So we formed a task force, MSI formed a task force of academics and practitioners to try and to come up with priorities for new research that will help develop a better, more relevant understanding of what we're calling digitized customers in digitized environments. And so this is really, I think a perfect example of academic industry collaboration to figure out what's relevant that we should then work on together to develop, actionable knowledge. So a group of leading academics, from an international set of universities, some leading marketing practitioners, some of whom I noticed are on the webinar today, so hello. From some really leading companies across different industries and categories. And we got together and we just had a conversation about a lot of these issues and came up with a set of priorities, research priorities, which if you're an MSI member, you can access the white paper that talks about this and proposes some research questions. And certainly if you're part of an MSI member company and you have a look at that and you're interested in doing some research around these priorities, please contact MSI and they'll help connect you with academics who would be interested in working together. And here's just, I'm not going to read through all of these priorities, but this is just to give you a flavor of things. Is what we came up with, right? So a pretty diverse set of questions ranging from the first one, which is, how does marketing fit in with everyone else, basically? Particularly IT. How does marketing and IT work together from the C-suite down? All the way to, say, the fifth one there, what's the optimal balance between human and non-human touch points in a customer journey? Kind of getting back to, the sort of the rise of the robots and automation that I mentioned briefly earlier. So this is just to give an example of, I think, if there's the research that has been done looking back, which I think is helpful to identify some gaps, but really a key point there is, we've sort of maybe lost our way a little bit and diverged in terms of the academics and the practitioners in terms of what we're really doing and trying to understand as we grapple with new technologies in marketing and how to use them effectively and efficiently. But I think, to push the needle and to move forward, we've got to do these sorts of initiatives where we sit together and we actually decide what's important and try and work together on it. And this is an example of an initiative which is very much in the tradition of what MSI has always sought to do. And this is what we're trying to do within this particular space of digital, social media, and mobile. So with that, I want to make sure we've got enough time for Q&A. So I just sort of wrap up quickly and then open it up for the questions. So just to summarize, I think, as I said, the digital world's always changing. There's lots and lots and lots of new new stuff, new technologies, new tools, new techniques, new platforms, basically new opportunities and challenges that are being faced by marketers on a daily basis. And this pace of change is really only accelerating. I really believe that this is exciting, but we need to be careful in terms of how we allocate our resources to all of this, because not everything is going to make sense. So we need to develop better ways for sort of dipping our toes in the water and testing and learning, and better sort of processes for doing that. Because I think this, to the second point, that the research that we've done really does suggest quite a fragmentation. So there's lots of stuff going on, really, really, really broad, but not necessarily all that deep on the vast majority of topics or what your technologies or platforms. And I think that probably means we're missing some things, and I'd say that's happening on both the academic and practice side. So we need to move forward, and we need to remember, I think, as a sort of a guiding light, that the technologies we're talking about here are tools. I think technology-enabled marketing is where marketing is at. I actually don't like the term digital marketing. I think it's just marketing. There's technology involved in everything that we do. And I think to help us grapple with that, this sort of marketing with purpose, keeping our eyes on the prize and thinking about how technology can help us do that is an important way to think. And in order to achieve all of that, from a research and thought leadership and actionable insights approach, I think we need more collaboration so that we can do it really well. So with that, thank you for listening. I appreciate you taking the time. And now we're going to have Q&A, and so I'll turn it back to Earl, who will moderate the discussion.
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. And we did have a number of questions that came in during your presentation. So let's start with those. Laura's asked the question, could the difference in the mentions from academics and business press that you shared early on be the result of increasing complexity that's being neglected by business people more often? I mean, one of the challenges in applying the academic research that MSI supports and works with academics like yourself to produce is then making it relevant and applicable to business practice, which necessarily means perhaps maybe simplifying some of the more complex findings. But just your thoughts about, is there sort of an inherent tension there between rigorous academic research and then the way it can actually be applied by business?
Yes and no. I mean, no, I don't think there's necessarily a tension between rigorous scientific research and sort of ease of application. I think there's no point in even trying to apply something to practice that comes out of academic research unless that research was rigorous. So you can trust it, you can believe in it. So I think the rigor has to be there. But I do think that part of the reason for this gap or the fragmentation that I mentioned, could be that on the practice side, it's you don't have time to take a breath. Whereas us academics sit in our ivory towers and sit around and think all day apparently. I wish it was that way. But I think that could be part of it, that there's sort of different paces at which these two sides of the coin operate at. But I think the ease of implementation aspect is a little bit of a red herring, because it's if there's something complex, and it needs to be complex because it's reflective of the system that's being modeled, or the world that's trying to be understood, and it's a complex, messy world. Then we need to just live with it. But I would say that on the academic side, we're all a bit guilty maybe sometimes of making things a little overly complicated, and we can do a better job on that front. But I think in the digital marketing space, things are complex, so we're just going to have to embrace that.
Well said, Andrew. And we at MSI, we strive to make our research rigorous, thanks to folks like you who do it. It's relevant because it's based on our member priorities, and we try to make it readable or accessible as well. And that's often the most challenging part of the process, as you say. And actually, one of the questions relates to that notion of the complexity of this new world that you mentioned, and that is, what are your thoughts about how you can relate traditional, linear advertising, TV, radio, print, and that sort of thing, to these new technologies, the digital, social, mobile? There's a lot of interest, obviously, in kind of a 360 view of media exposure, the consumers, and trying to begin to look at how those cards work together, putting, ROI calculations against different allocations of resources. So it's a pretty broad topic, obviously, but maybe just a couple of insights from your research about how you began to put all these pieces together.
So I think it's a really important question, and it's something that seemingly comes up more and more and more these days, which is good, because I think we talk a lot about this stuff and have for a while, but it's hard to do good research around it because of the data. But I think we're now getting to the point where we've got not perfect data that would because what we would need is a single view of a customer. So if you want to build a better sales response model or media mix model, for example, with just more media channels and more touch points, in that model, so you can see how they work together. You need that single view of the customer, which is just really, really hard when you're trying to compare something like TV to, mobile ads. How do you connect the dots, and the device IDs and so on. So I think we're not there yet, but there are ways to do this now that didn't exist necessarily, not that many years ago, that would enable it, at least on a sort of a smaller scale, to start to see how this would work. So I think it has been a data problem, but it's not anymore necessarily. But really, the broader issue is when we look at all of the different touch points, all the different media channels. I think the temptation, at least that I've heard from talking to practitioners and media buyers, planners, those sorts of people, is, well, they would just want to add another channel to the regression, so to speak, to the model. That's probably not quite hitting the nail on the head, because we need to look at how these interact with each other. So I think that academics would probably think about it this way, and realizing that there's I would call it a complex interplay among media channels. And we can model that, we can capture that, we can see how these things work, either synergistically or not synergistically, and that's important, because then we can think about how to allocate resources in a more intelligent way. So this is what has to be on the horizon, because there's just so many media channels and consumer touch points. We need to understand how these work as a system.
Great. So a couple of questions have come in asking for maybe specific examples from your own research. It might have been some of what you synthesized in the overview that you gave us just now, or it might be other work you've done. A couple of folks have asked it in terms of surprising findings about how these work together, or the impact of social mobile media. You mentioned, in the outset, you're doing a project currently at kind of a long-term impact of this. So from your own research, what are a couple of surprising findings that might have implications for the marketers and the audience, things they could apply and as they think about how to use these new channels?
For sure. So I'll speak actually to you mentioned those sort of long-term impact studies. So the precursor of that, which probably was a surprising finding. So this is some research that I did with Keith Wilcox, who's a marketing professor at Columbia Business School, that we published a few years ago in the Journal of Consumer Research, which was looking at really the effect of using Facebook. So seeing Facebook as a service that you consume, and what that does to consumer behavior. So we were in that study interested in how Facebook use impacted both a person's self-esteem, but probably more importantly, their self-control. And and because self-control is something that regulates all of our decisions and behaviors, including within sort of consumer decision-making processes. So it's a really important psychological construct. So what we found, and this was experimental research, so controlled experiments, something as seemingly benign as browsing your Facebook newsfeed for 5 minutes compared to a control group who read the news, like CNN.com, for instance, for 5 minutes. We found for people who on Facebook felt like they were connected to stronger ties, so closer friends and acquaintances, not just sort of mere acquaintances, but closer friends. They exhibited a boost in self-esteem after browsing Facebook, but then a decrease in self-control. So, for example, if we ask them to, pick a snack, do you want the healthy granola bar snack or do you want the unhealthy chocolate chip cookie? We didn't label them as healthy or unhealthy, but we just sort of presented these choices. People who had browsed Facebook for 5 minutes were disproportionately more likely to pick the unhealthy, chocolate chip cookies sort of as an indicator of suppressed self-control. And so we sort of discovered this, and I've done some follow-up research more recently. So there's one paper that's still a working paper with a few colleagues, Yichi Zhang, who's at Santa Clara, and Michael Trusov, who's at University of Maryland, where we looked at a tracking panel, Nielsen data, online tracking data of websites people browse and also online shopping behaviors. And so we could actually look for this empirical relationship between time spent using social media and particularly sites like Facebook, social networking sites, and online shopping behaviors to sort of see if this self-control effect plays out. And that looks like exactly what we're finding. So more time spent on social media does seem to be associated with more online shopping behavior, and seemingly also more impulse purchasing in terms of categories that typically are bought on a more impulsive basis. So that's an example of thinking about impacts and what they and what the consequences are. And the research that we're doing now at Oxford is going to be tracking people's social media use over an even longer period of time and looking at a whole host of indicators of individual well-being to understand broader impacts of using this service. So that's one example. Another quick example of how these media channels play together. So there's a paper I published a few years ago with Jeff Gallick, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon. And we looked at traditional earned media, so things like press, publicity, and social earned media. So people talking about the brand, for example, in social media, online communities, and so on, and how that impacted sales for a micro lending website, as an example. And what we found actually in terms of long run effects, social media activities, so people posting stuff in an online community, was more valuable in the long run than press mentions, than getting in the TV news or in national newspapers, for example, in terms of driving long-term impacts on sales. So in the short run, you'd see a big spike if the New York Times wrote about your company, for example, or your website, because that's just going to drive a bunch of people there to check it out. But that goes away. Whereas the online community, the social aspect, the social media aspect, is kind of like this engine room that's sort of chugging along constantly in the background, keeping everything going. And in the long run, that's more valuable as a sales driver than sort of the big spike but short-lived sort of traditional media effects. So that's an example of when you start to look at these things playing together, how you can get more complex and interesting insights.
That's interesting, especially in light of one of the questions which came up about the role of the online versus offline word of mouth. As you pointed out, a lot of the academic research was on word of mouth, and it was most accessible to academics when it happened online and could be scraped off of websites and that sort of thing. But in fact, most of it, of course, occurs offline, and that's where it has its impact. So it raises a more general question about is this new world of mobile, social, digital media changing the way consumers actually make decisions and influence each other, or is it simply we have more points of contact, a greater range, you might say, for the word-of-mouth influence than in the past, but that the fundamental mechanisms of authority and persuasiveness and so forth still hold? So I know that was part of the discussion that you and the others participated in around the Digitized Customer Initiative. So maybe your thoughts about that. To what extent are we seeing traditional understanding of decision-making playing out in new media, or are the media themselves actually changing the way consumers make decisions?
So I think, to the first point about word of mouth, and I mean, of course, there's a lot more word of mouth, which is very much a catch-all term, which we could probably be more precise about, but let's just call it word of mouth. There's plenty more word of mouth that happens in an offline context, face-to-face communication, for sure, than is probably happening online. Certainly in terms of people's creation of content, so to speak. And that's true, and that's fair enough. And I don't think word of mouth as a phenomenon in marketing is something that has only become important with the emergence of social media, for example, because obviously it's been important for a very, very long time, or it's been something that people have considered as potentially important for a very long time. I do think that what do the digital channels now give us? They give us better measurement of this. They give us different types of word of mouth, and so that's why I'm sort of alluding to this dislike for word of mouth as a catch-all term, because we could lump a lot of things underneath that, but they're all potentially different. So online reviews, that's a form of word of mouth, but then within online reviews you've got what someone writes, you've got the ratings numbers people give, let's say a hotel. You might even get video that people upload, so there's different types, even within that there's subtypes within the type of word of mouth. Then there's what people would post in social media channels about something. There's photos that people would post on Instagram, and then we've now got what people are calling dark social, which is all the social media that can't get tracked and measured and therefore monitored and built into all of our nice media response models, because it's happening in encrypted private chat, on WhatsApp and these sorts of platforms. So, I think there's a lot that we still, just don't see when it comes to word of mouth. But I think the interesting challenge for marketers is, okay, well, we realize that. The question is, how much of what we do see in the digital space, how representative is that of everything else? Is that sort of the tip of the iceberg, but it's really just one iceberg? Or is what we see being talked about on Facebook, for example, from a word-of-mouth perspective, is that completely different to the sorts of things people are saying privately? And if so, then we can't just assume that the online is representative of the offline, and we need to think about the differences and understand those differences. So, there's no hard and fast answer here. I think it raises important questions, though, from a research standpoint.
That actually is an interesting segue to the next question, which is, it goes back to your kind of historical account. Paul sent a question in to the effect that early on in the rise of social media, the notion of user-generated content, which is one of your topic areas, the notion of co-creation seemed to be really very important to how brands actually engage consumers and so forth. We've done entire conferences on that topic, as you know. There seemed to be less focus on that in recent years. Is that just because academics have moved on to other topics, or is it perhaps as social media has become so ubiquitous and so much part of our lives that these occasions of co-creation or user-generated content don't stand out as much as they might have once done for both consumers and academics? In other words, become part of the natural environment these days. What are your thoughts about that?
I think based on looking back in time, UGC really was reviews, hotel reviews, product reviews, sort of stuff, as opposed to something more broadly in terms of co-creation. That said, though, sort of as one of the other things I didn't mention was related to this journal of marketing paper. One of the other things we looked at is what's about to be published. Sort of forthcoming articles in the top journals, and you see more co-creation. I don't know, collaborative product development, more user-generated content, but looking at things like influencers in social media, YouTube stars, these sorts of people. You're starting to see more of that emerge. That I think is coming, coming soon, so to speak, in terms of what academics are studying. So I think this is a good example of a topic area that is absolutely a moving target. Because there's lots of different forms of content that people can create. Those types of content may have different impacts on other consumers, as well as the brands themselves, and we need to be watching these trends in some sense and figuring out what they mean. I mean, a really good example at the moment is if you talk to any marketer who seems to be in sort of a consumer marketing space, they're definitely thinking about things like influencers, and seeded campaigns, viral marketing campaigns. These are sort of all terms that are now getting referred to as influencer marketing. This is a hot topic now. Whether it's here to stay or it's sort of a false economy that's being built up and is going to fizzle out, because I think a lot of money is being paid by beauty companies, for example, to people with Instagram followings and not necessarily seeing a good return on that. But again, this is an area where we need more research, so we can try and sort through what makes sense and what works versus what is a waste of time and a waste of resources.
That's great. It reminds me of a comment one of our members made many years ago, that he looks to MSI to be a haven from hype, is the way he put it. And I think the rigorous academic research, thanks to you and others like you, helps us step back a little bit, take a deep breath, see, is this really a new phenomenon? Is this really the latest thing that we need to jump on board? Or if so, what are the sort of boundary conditions, circumstances under which it does or doesn't work? And with that, I want to come back to one last question, which kind of is based on several questions we got, and that's just more broadly the role of technology in marketing. You were early on cautioning that we not just use technology for its own sake. It's a tool. It's a way to enable some of the activities we've always done with consumers. And I want to come back to your example of the robot concierge or the chatbots and so forth. As you know, that meeting that we had several months ago to talk about topics on the digitized customer, one of the areas you pointed out was to what extent can we automate and take away the human element in interactions with consumers? Sometimes that might be valuable and beneficial. Other times it might be the wrong move. Just sort of your closing thoughts about how we get the use of technology right and maybe not do just because it can be done.
So it goes back to sort of the bullseye and that sort of circular framework I was talking about, which is really thinking about value. And where, for whom really is the value being created. So when we think about automation, robots, these sorts of things, I think, and sort of this trade-off between human versus non-human interactions and touch points. I think these are really important questions, but I think we need to go back and think about, well, what does the customer want, and what's good for the other stakeholders. So sure, we could develop the technology to have some AI-based customer service app, which will maybe most of the time be okay and deliver a decent customer experience, but other times being incredibly frustrating and annoying to the customer because it keeps getting it wrong. So how far do we want to go in doing that? So I think learning what the customer wants, what the limits are, when the customer really needs that human touch versus would actually prefer the opposite. I think these are the important questions when we think about embracing automation. Oddly enough, I think that the one final thing I'll say about automation is it doesn't just apply on the consumer side. So in that framework I presented, it was value for business, society, and for people, and the other part of people is employees. And I was just having a conversation with some of my MBA students today who are trying to understand the future of work for advertising creatives. And they're thinking about automation and AI and all these sorts of things and how that affects the creative process in developing ad campaigns. I think so it doesn't just hit on the consumer side, it also hits on the marketing function side too. And I think we need to think broadly but also deeply about where things like automation can help us out, because I think there's a way, but we need to be careful and think about the people involved and what do they actually get out of it and what do they value, so that we can, at the end of the day, we want to do great marketing.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and it sounds like a great topic for a future MSI webinar, maybe an entire conference. I want to thank Andrew and thank our audience again for your questions and engagement throughout the talk today. If we didn't get to your questions or there are additional things you'd like to discuss, you can reach out to Andrew at the email address, which we're displaying in the chat box there. It's andrew.stephen@sbs.ox.ac.uk. And our next webinar will be December 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll feature P.K. Kanan and Michelle Vadel of the University of Maryland. They will also be talking about the article that they wrote for the special issue Journal of Marketing based on one of the MSI priority areas. So be sure to tune in for that. Many thanks again to members of the MSI audience for participating in our member-to-member webinar series.